It's a real honor to welcome Ken Shuldman today. Ken is an award-winning creative mind whose career in advertising has left its mark on some of the most iconic brands in the world, from American Express to Hershey. In fact, if you've ever sung Give Me a Break while unwrapping a Kit Kat, you've already heard some of Ken's work. But beyond the jingles and the campaigns, Ken has used his storytelling gifts for something even more profound, uncovering and sharing the powerful, nearly forgotten story of Louis Bannet, a Dutch Jewish trumpet player whose life took him from international stardom to the very depths of Auschwitz and miraculously through it. Ken's book, Jazz Survivor: The Story of Louis Bannet, Horn Player of Auschwitz, brings this extraordinary tale to light. And it's not just a story of survival, it touches on so much: the indomitable spirit of jazz. As the great trumpeter, or great saxophonist Johnny Griffin once said, this is music made by and for people who choose to feel good in spite of conditions. The horrors and resilience of the Holocaust, the role of music as both solace and a weapon, and the deep cultural exchange between Black and Jewish communities, and more, I'm sure, which we'll explore today. Louis Bannet has become such a huge hero to me, and I'm so grateful to you, Ken, for sharing his story in your book. Um, it's a story that I'm sure will continue to inspire, challenge, and move us all. So, welcome, and thank you so much for coming today.
Oh, my pleasure, Joe.
Man, I know one. I know the book begins actually with a quote from Elie Wiesel, who actually founded Moment magazine, and he mentioned Louis in Night, and he said that the quote is, "We drew up in ranks of five with the musicians. They were nearly all Jews. Juliak, a bespectacled Pole with a cynical smile on his pale face. Louis, a distinguished musician who came from Holland. He complained that they would not let him play Beethoven. Jews were not allowed to play German music." I feel like that's such a great place to start because before we really get into Louis' story, his personal story, that kind of touches on like everything that this overall story is. So I thought it'd be nice to set a little context. It says that Jews were not allowed to play Beethoven. So, what where
It's
should
kind
we
of a
begin?
it's kind of
Yeah.
a bittersweet irony, Joe, that we're talking here, under the auspices of Moment Magazine, which Elie Wiesel co-founded, I think back in 1975. Um, you're right. Louis and Elie were in Auschwitz together. I mean, they didn't know each other, I don't think. They did meet on that infamous line in the lineups, and ironically, when the museum opened, in 1997, I met Ely, and at the opening, and I told him about that Louis trumpet is here, which I think he knew, and that I was writing a book about it, and he said, "Well, please send me the transcript," and I did, and he wrote back a lovely letter and a little quote, which is used in the back of the book. But again, it's here we are, like in 2025, um, talking about this man who met when they met. And Ely was just a teenager, I think, in Auschwitz, and when Louis arrived in Auschwitz in Birkenau, he was probably around 30. So, and I remember Ely in his book saying, like, even he was scratching his head. Why are there musicians here? You know,
Mm,
and then as the days went on, and he saw how the Germans used music, he understood. And the thing that's ironic about Louis not playing Beethoven, again, even though he auditioned for the orchestra as a trumpet player, he was a violin prodigy at first, and he was playing Beethoven in the camps, and that's not allowed, which is kind of ironic because they let them play, music written by Jewish composers played by African Americans, which is what they requested in their parties and so forth and so forth. So there's a kind of like bittersweet irony there as well. You can't play German music, but go ahead, play Duke Ellington, play, George Gershwin, which they did.
yeah, I read somewhere that the Germans saw Jews playing German music as Jews polluting German music. So,
Yeah, it just it gets to a fundamental issue about you know the Germans historically, they were a very musical country. Look, Beethoven, Bach, all these great composers that came out of Germany. I mean, every town in Germany has a town square where the band plays, and so here we are, and they're setting up the camps, and you look at the inventory of what they need, and ironically, they need orchestras, and they had orchestras in practically every camp. whether it
Mm,
was a women's camp, a gypsy camp, a work camp, and and the ultimate irony again is here we have an orchestra in Birkenau, which was not a work camp like some of the other camps. As Louis said, you did not come to Birkenau to work. You came to Birkenau to die.
mm,
And so, the average lifespan of anybody in Birkenau, whether they're healthy or not, was 3 to 4 weeks. Even if you were healthy, and as the trains came in, they had to sort of replace with other people. And the
mm,
ultimate thing about Louis is that because he played the trumpet, because he became so popular in that camp, he was there for over 2 years, which is kind of unheard of. And
mm,
it's kind of a testament to his kind of indomitable spirit and just the way he thought. And I know we had talked about this before. He was a band leader, and band leaders think a certain way about, what do I need? How do I read the room? What songs do I need? And even though he was in this place of horror, he had that mentality with his instrument, and that's
mm.
that's what kept him alive.
Wow. Often I'm so fascinated by this subject, how, Louis' story and how jazz music was treated during the war. And a lot of times when I tell people that I'm interested in the, music during the Holocaust, people say, well, there was music written. They know that there was music written during the camps, written in the camps. People
Yes.
don't know these types of stories as much, I feel like. And I guess it'd be interesting just to talk about what was the purpose of having music in a death camp?
Well, it's sadly quite simple.
Yeah.
The Nazis believed that um, by hearing marching music, and again, and prisoners were constantly being marched around, whether out the doors through the work to do some work, or even marching to the gas chambers. Um,
Mm,
the Nazis thought that by if they hear music where they're marching in step, that will make them work better and make them walk out in step and
mm,
walk out and walk in. And again, but they also use music for kind of some certain diabolical reasons. Louis would occasionally set up with parts of the orchestra by the train stations.
mm,
And the music would carry downwind. So if you're on a transport coming into Birkenau and you heard music, you know, you would think, well, I hear music. I mean, how bad can this be? And so
hmm,
it was very deceptive, very diabolical. And again, and that same marching music was used for people marching to the gas chambers. Um,
mm,
and music was a constant in all the camps, but especially in Birkenau, where where the end was near, every day.
mm. Yeah, there's one quote I highlighted from your book. I mean, there's many, but this is one. The musician's barrack was situated near the main gate where the words, translate to work makes men free, were inscribed. But if the Nazis believed that work made men free, they also believed that music made them work better, especially if it was a rousing German march. I remember I went to Auschwitz a few years ago, and this was when I first became kind of acquainted with this story. And I remember our guide said, "This is where the musicians set up. What kind of music do you think they played?" And I said, "Sad music." And he said, "No, no, 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 no. This was," and I thought it'd just be not nice, but important. You shared a clip of the music that Louis shared with you of what they would play when the trains came in, just so everyone could hear a little bit of how
Sure, yeah.
um, bizarre this was.
Yeah, this is Alta Kameraden, which is one of the most famous marches in history. It was used by the Germans. It's been used it's been used here. It's been used all across the world.
Mm,
But when Louis, I know we can talk about this later, but when Louis auditioned
mhm,
for the orchestra, he played, as you know, St. Louis Blues. But
mhm.
but this was the second piece he played because the capo of the orchestra held up a piece of sheet music with this music just to see if Louis can read music,
Wow.
and he nailed it.
Hopefully you heard that. Hopefully
I
it
did.
played. Yes, but yeah, that's just so jarring to hear that and to, you know, uh try to put put yourself in that position or just even imagine that music being heard at such a place like Auschwitz.
And that was probably about 4:30 in the morning when they first started. Um,
Wow.
to they would gather. The musicians would get up first, and they would
Mm,
be seated, in their seats, and they would be. There was a young boy who was one of the kids who worked in the camp there, he was also a prisoner, but he passed out sheet music and put it on all the music stands. And Louis said it was always, Alta Camaraden, which everybody knew, by after a while by heart. But he would pass out the sheet music, and they would play as men would assemble and head off to either pound rocks or collect pieces of buildings that were bombed or whatever. I mean, just
mm,
meaningless work. And then they would play that same music as people were marched to their ultimate destination. And it's funny, and every time you hear that song, you feel like you're either at a football game or watching a parade. But when you think
mm.
about the way it was used in Auschwitz, it's it's just pretty diabolical when you think about it.
Mhm. Yeah, I mean, I know that songs like that, not only would they give, the false impression to the prisoners that, things might be okay, but I mean, they were designed to be loud, or they picked loud music so you could drown out things like screams and things like that. It's just so diabolical, totally.
Yeah,
Um,
and there was and again, but a lot of the orchestra was brass, so it was
mhm,
even louder
mm,
for those reasons that you mentioned.
mm. Well, I know with Louis, his story is very unique because he was pretty famous in Holland before he went up to Auschwitz. Can we just back up a little bit and share a bit about his upbringing and who he was
Sure.
before he went into the camp?
Well, again, we can go. Louis was again. He was born in Rotterdam in August 15th, 1911,
Mm,
into a family. He was the youngest of nine children. And by the time he was like 5 or 6, most of his siblings had moved on, and they were very, very poor. And he lived in kind of like the Helmstraat. It's kind of like it's like the Lower East Side of like Rotterdam. Very
mm,
poor, mostly Jewish. And anyway, so in his building, there was another little kid who played violin, and he was terrible. And Louis used to sit by his doorstep and listen because he just loved the sound of the violin. And so, but one day the boy's father came out and said, um, "This instrument should be played by someone who can appreciate and play it." And he gave Louis his son's violin. And as time went on, Louis was self-taught. He practiced every day. I remember speaking to. There's a picture in my book of Louis and his friends on the streets in Rotterdam, and one of his friends was this man named Leon Greenman who lived in the UK. And he would always say, we would always yell out the window for Louis to come down and play, and he would never would because he was always practicing, which hopefully paid off later on in his life. But anyway, so he became a prodigy. He became and he was enrolled in the Jewish Conservatory in Rotterdam, which was set up by the Jewish Council in Holland. And he became so proficient at it that by the time he was 13 or 14, he was playing for the Queen Wilhelmina of Holland. But he soon realized, he once said to me, when he started, because he really was the sole support of his family.
mm,
Music was the way he supported his family. His father was kind of like an alcoholic laborer, and his mother was a housewife. And they didn't really have much money. And so he realized that music was going to be, the way to support his family. But so he started playing odd jobs with the violin. He would play, like, for instance, at silent movie shows, and he would be playing for things like Laurel and Hardy. And he actually got fired because the owner of the theater said, "I told you to play, not to laugh." And because he would be laughing through the whole theater, through the whole performance of the movie. But anyway, so he realized, he once one of my favorite lines that he ever told me was that at that time there were more violin players in Holland than tulips. And I realized if I was going to make a living, I had to find another instrument. So he was able to gather some money from a relative, and he went to a music store, and he was going to buy a saxophone, but he didn't have enough money. So he got a trumpet. Um, and just like the violin, he found a teacher, and by the time he was like 18 or 19, he was a really good trumpet player. And there used to be a music hiring hall down by the docks in Rotterdam. And Rotterdam was kind of like it's kind of like like Liverpool. These big port towns with sailors used to come in. And they'd always bring like records and things like that. And that's where
Mm,
he first heard Louis Armstrong. He played the music of the Hot Five and the Hot Seven and all those great early Armstrong recordings. And that was it for him. As soon as he heard that,
mm,
it was over. He had to play this. And he started playing the trumpet, playing in kind of like odd little novelty bands, until eventually in the 1930s he formed this band called Louis Bannet and the Rhythm Five with his fellow Dutch musicians, and they
mm,
became kind of like an overnight sensation because he would close every show with a performance of St. Louis Blues, and he would imitate Louis's voice and he would sing like Louis Armstrong as well. And it was really the press who dubbed him the Dutch Louis Armstrong.
mm.
And from there, he started playing, all around Central Europe and Belgium and Germany and France and all over Holland. And it became really, really famous. His
Mm.
posters were everywhere. And then in May of 1940, when the Nazis invaded Holland, um, they passed all these they started passing all these decrees, and the one that really hit home for Louis was that Jews were not allowed to play in clubs or go into clubs or go into restaurants, and
Mm.
that's when he knew his days were numbered. And so he had a friend in the Dutch underground who decided to and said to him, "You are too well known to stay in Amsterdam." And he brought him to a small little farming village in the Netherlands, and he stayed there for several months. Um, and this was in about 1940, 1941, hitting into 1942. And then one day he was sitting in a bakery reading a paper, and a Dutch Gestapo officer came in with a giant poster of Louis Bannet that he had confiscated from another member of the Dutch underground who helped hide him, this woman in this town. And he was arrested, eventually arrested, and arrested by someone who said, my wife and I used to love going to your shows. Now come with me, basically. And they took him to a prison in this small little town, and eventually he was sent to Westerbork, where the trains depart from, and from Westerbork he was sent to Auschwitz-Birkenau. And so that was in this January of 1943,
Mm.
and of the 500, there was 516 people on that train. And when the train arrived in Birkenau, um, that's where Joseph Mengele stood on the platform and directed people left and right who will live and who will die. And of those 516 people, 17 were spared, and Louis was one of those.
Wow. I know
And
it's oh, sorry, I didn't mean to
no, no,
interrupt.
go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, I mean, it's so bizarre that he was arrested by a former fan, but it could have been luck with a fan when he was being tattooed in Auschwitz that saved him also. Is that true?
That's true. I
Yeah.
mean, because what happens is when a transport comes in, when transport comes into the camps, usually they try to put if it's a Dutch transport that came like from Westerbork or Amsterdam, they would
Mm,
assign somebody from the Sonderkommando, which is the group of people who took all the belongings, whatever, and kept them in this place called Canada. And it's funny, I always wanted to know why they used to call it Canada. And Louis told me that because Canada to people in Holland was a place of great wealth, and and so that's where they kept all the belongings, musical instruments and so forth and so forth. Anyway, so the person who was assigned to tattoo his transport was this guy named Hein Frank, who Louis knew from the clubs in Amsterdam. He was actually a pimp. that hung out at the clubs, and Louis knew him quite well. And when it became Louis's turn to get his number, again, don't forget he was the night before he was standing out in the Polish winter, like freezing, and he had frostbite in his ear and whatever, and so he didn't really see anybody, and it was Hein Frank who recognized him and told him that there was an orchestra in the camp, and Louis looked at him like he was mad. He said, there's only mud and dead people here. What are you talking about? And
Mm,
he says, there is an orchestra here, and I will get you in. And then he gave him the number 93626 and said he will come for him. And
mm,
the next day, he took Louis to this room called the Musikstube, which is where they kept all the instruments and where they had the auditions for the camp orchestra. And that is probably the most, probably the strangest audition in musical history. If I, when I remember the first
mhm,
time I heard it, I was like scratching my head and just saying, it's just hard to believe. And so again, so Louis walked in with three musicians that he actually knew from Holland. There was a saxophonist, a trombonist, and a clarinet player that he knew and had played with. Um, Again, it was freezing. All these people, their lips were frozen, their hands were frozen, and they were told to play. And so
mm,
Hein Frank would give each person the instrument of their choice. And when the first couple of musicians couldn't play a note, the capo, this horrible human being called Franz Kapka, who was the capo of the orchestra, um, would send them to the gas chambers. And you can't play. It was simple as that. You can't stay. So then it was Louis' turn, and Hein and so anyway, so while this was going on, Louis noticed this cast iron stove in the room, and his lips were all frozen, whatever. So he put his hands on the stove and started warming up his lips and rubbing them to sort of get the blood flowing in his lips because he realized what was going on here. And so finally,
mm.
Hein Frank gives him a trumpet, and it was Hein Frank who basically said to him those words, "Louis, you must play for your life." And that was, I mean, and that was a moniker that stayed with Louis for the rest of his life. And so here he is trying to play. He's rubbing his lips with his hands. And at first, there's a couple of notes that come out, nothing really coherent. And the capo's getting really impatient, getting signaling to his guards to take him away. And finally, he brings it the breath. He brings up his breath and starts playing the opening of St. Louis Blues. And he was I mean, even the capo was saying that how this man sounds like a cannon, and
Mm.
so he played the tune, and before that's when and then finally the capo brought out the sheet music of Alta Camerata and asked Louis if he can read music, and of course he could, and he played Alta Camerata, and Louis took his trumpet, he tied it around his waist, um, and Kopka and Franz and Hein Frank let him out, and from there on he went to his barrack, which was a barrack actually right near those gates, because Elie Wiesel was actually right in one of those barracks as well, right near the gates,
Oh,
and that was the music barrack, and that's where he stayed for the next almost 2.5 years.
wow. Well, there's two things that's I mean, I've heard the story a million times and I still have the chills every time. It's incredible. But two things really came to mind. One thing was that one of the first things that really kind of hit me kind of personally in a way, because I hadn't really thought of this, was when he was brought to the room to pick out the trumpet that he's going to play. And he sees like tons of instruments. He has a selection of, any instrument pretty much. And it just occurred to me in that moment as I was reading about it in the book, how many people I know who, if they were told to evacuate their homes, they would bring an instrument with them, like a guitar or something. And
Exactly.
these are all of those instruments. And it's just, I don't know, it's just a powerful thing to
It's
think
well, it's
about.
also amazing because again, Um, when one of the first pieces of communication that we did for the Museum of Jewish Heritage, um, which again is a really a fascinating museum because again, it tells the story of Jewish life before, during, and after the war. And it focuses on personal stories. And one of its missions was to sort of get behind the numbers and tell, that these were not just numbers. Like the first time I took a tour of the museum, the director said something to me that I would I'll never forget. He said, Hitler didn't kill 6 million Jews. He killed one, and then another, and then another,
Mm,
and then another, and that just really stuck with me. And so
mm,
the very first like sort of poster we did for the museum had the headline 6 million people were murdered because of who they were. But who were they?
mm,
Well, you know what? They were actors, they were scientists, they were lumberjacks, they were teachers, and they were musicians. The music stuba was filled with so many instruments because so many musicians who played in the orchestras of Europe were Jewish. And like you said, if the house was burning and you're going on a train, I got to take my instruments. So that music room was filled with, um, I mean, priceless instruments, probably Stradivariuses and things like that, but also these
mm,
incredible trumpets and trombones, um, because all the musicians who came into the camps, you know, took their instruments with them, and
mm.
that's where the Sonderkommando, um, they took them and put them in this room, and they were used in the orchestra.
Wow. Well, the other thing that really came to mind is it seems that Louis had this fascination throughout his whole life with St. Louis Blues, which was written St. Louis Blues, which was written by W.C. Handy. I know that he loved the recording of Louis Armstrong in the Hot Five with Bessie Smith as a kid. Then I know he played it with Coleman Hawkins before the war,
He did.
and then he auditioned with it, and he had a life with it after the war too. And I know you heard from W.C. Handy's was it his granddaughter
His
about this?
granddaughter, yes, yeah.
Yeah.
She
Well,
had
what's
seen.
the fascination with the song and about that communication?
I think for Louis, I mean, it was one of the first songs again, the last note of Louis Armstrong's recording is this incredible high C. I think it's a high C, and
Mm,
that was one of the first things that Louis Bandet heard, when he heard Louis Armstrong play for the first time, was like he had never heard anybody hit a note so high. And when he started testing that song out in his performances in clubs like the Lido in Amsterdam, and there's a famous nightclub called Shores as well, that was the song that everybody responded to. That was the tune that everybody
mm,
responded to, and they responded even more when he started doing his own little imitation of Louis. And so that was, and then you can blame it on the press who dubbed him the Dutch Louis Armstrong. There was no way that he was going to have a performance without playing that song.
right.
So whether that be on stage or in Auschwitz.
I know the song has a minor key part and a major key part, so I didn't know if something about his growing up Jewish and hearing minor key songs like that might have had something to do with resonating with
It
it.
probably it probably did. It probably did. I think, again, when he was in the Jewish conservatory with all his young friends, um, he again that I was as I mentioned, like that band leader mentality that he had. He organized a group of young players, and he says, "Come on, let's play weddings, let's play bar mitzvahs. We can make some
Mm,
extra money." And the professors didn't mind as long as they kept up their studies. But he, even then at 12 and 13, he was a little hustler, and he was playing bands and weddings, and that he had that mindset forever, forever.
mm. Well, I know the band leader mentality. I'm aware of it just for being a musician and being a band leader. We always feel like we have to take care of our guys. We feel a
Exactly.
responsibility. How did that how did that work when he was, I mean, I know he was a leader in Auschwitz too. I mean,
He was, and
yeah.
it was I remember I was just looking at some stories that I had done a while back before I wrote the book. Again, and there was this one of the musicians in this band was this a musician named Henry Meyer, who was an amazing violinist, went on to found the LaSalle String Quartet. But in the Birkenau Orchestra, he didn't play violin. He played cymbals because
Mm,
they didn't want a violin player, and so he didn't know anything about cymbals, but he'd been play he played in an orchestra. He knew what to do, and the so he played the cymbals, and so when he met Louis after the war in back in Toronto, he told Louis that you were the king of the orchestra.
Mm,
And that's kind of how the guards saw him that way also. And so he was always like even though there was 40, 50 other musicians in the orchestra, they all pointed at Louis as the leader. Even though like there was a conductor, this gentleman Simon Lax, who was a
mm,
Polish conductor, well-known classical musician, everybody came to Louis because when the Germans, when the guards wanted their little parties, whatever, they didn't really want to hear classical music. They wanted to hear jazz. They wanted to hear,
mm,
uh, Between the Devil and Deep Blue Sea and songs like that. And so that was Louis' forte. And so that's how he became kind of like the star of the orchestra by becoming like the most requested musician to come around.
mm. And when you say most requested musician, I mean, he was playing. Can you talk a little bit about some of these parties he would play for, like,
Well,
I don't want to give it
probably the
away.
most infamous one is when he was woken up one night by this by a guard and told to get his instrument and come outside and please bring, and not please, but just bring three other musicians with you. So he selected these three other musicians that he knew, and they were told to come outside. He thought he was going to be shot. He felt like this is it, my life is over. But they were put into this car, and they were driven to this country estate in the Polish countryside. And it turned out that they were there to be the band for a party, and the party was a birthday party for Joseph Mengele, the Angel of Death, who Louis had seen when he first arrived at the camp. And I remember it's funny because people always ask me, they ask me if I have ever been to Auschwitz, and actually I haven't, but I feel the time that I spent with Louis, I felt like I was there. Because I
Mm,
remember asking Louis, do you remember faces, whatever? He says that he could paint them if he had to. So, I mean, because I remember he once said that Mengele reminded him of Clark Gable. And so, anyway, so he was brought to this house, and they were brought upstairs, overlooking like a balcony, and the party was downstairs, and they placed these large plants in front of them because they didn't want any of the guests to see them. And so it was Louis. They had somebody with a snare drum, a clarinet player, and I think a saxophone player. And they were able to sort of see what was going on through through the leaves and whatever, and they saw that this was a party. They saw Mengele, and they also saw that there was gypsy women there, and there was some young boys, as well as people who worked in the office pool at the party.
mm,
A lot of the Germans who lived outside the camp were at the party, and so Louis again on his way in the car there, again, thinking like a band leader, wrote down a set list. Because I mean, the last thing he wants to do is arrive there and say, like, well, what do we play? So he had the set list in his mind. He had nothing to write it down with, but he knew, songs like, Ain't Misbehavin' and I Only Have Eyes for You and things like that. And they just rattled off songs, then they played them. Oh, they may have repeated some, but they played. But while they were playing, they were thinking about music, yes, but all they kept doing, they kept smelling the food because
mm,
because downstairs there was all this they were all this food and whatever, and there was food in some of the one of the little rooms of the ante rooms where they were playing, and they kept darting their eyes, they're seeing like potatoes and sausages and things like that, and it was driving them crazy, and they were trying to play. And so, but meanwhile, they're watching, Mengele dance and with these beautiful gypsy women. And Mengele was clearly enjoying himself, and he clearly remembered uh, who was providing the music. He was told about Louis by one of his comrades, because a couple of either a week or so, a week or two later, Louis was summoned to the gypsy camp in which was part of Auschwitz-Birkenau, and where Mengele basically had his kind of headquarters, because that's where he did his horrible experiments. Because he kept the gypsies, the gypsies were allowed to sort of be in their normal clothes. They didn't shave their heads. They were actually well fed because sadly a lot of the children were used for experiments. And so when Louis was brought there, he was asked by Mengele's associate that Joseph Mengele wants an orchestra in the gypsy camp. And so Louis would come back every day and meet with the gypsy musicians, and he formed an orchestra there. And which was going to which they would there was going to be a concert. Um, what he didn't know at the time is that this was going to be a final concert because the camp was going to be liquidated. Um, and so it was this again this sort of the strange coincidence of somebody seeing Louis' talent and putting it to this use. And as Louis said to me, and every day that I played was another day that I lived. It was
Mm,
really as simple as that. And whether it was in Birkenau or in the gypsy camp, that's how I had to survive, and that's what
mm.
he did.
There's one quote I remember reading it. He was stronger than Hitler as long as he had his trumpet. It's
Exactly.
very
And so
powerful.
yeah, and so again, he said, the guards and everybody else had their their guns on their waists, and I had my trumpet,
Mm,
and I felt I was stronger.
wow.
I felt he felt needed there for some reason some of the guards had really befriended him and protected him as well.
Mm,
There were times when the capo Kapka, he was so jealous of Louis. He really nothing would please him more than to have him thrown out of the orchestra and killed. And he
mm,
devised many ways to do it. And but when one time when because he knew that when trumpet players blow into their mouthpiece, sometimes saliva, is stored into the mouthpiece. And so one time he was playing and some saliva got on Kopka's face. And so he had Louis beaten, thrown out of the orchestra. But when one of the guards found out, he was furious and brought Louis back into the orchestra and beat the capo and had the
mm.
capo beaten. So he had these friends, for better or for worse, who protected him because he's my trumpet player, basically.
Mm, right. Wow. Well, I don't want to give away the whole book because we want people to read the book. I love the book. And I was just, curious a little bit if we could touch a bit on, what happened to him after the war. And also very curious on how you came to know this story and want to write a book about this.
After the war, Louis, again, he was in several he was in one or two other camps. He was in the Death March after Auschwitz, and went to some of the camps. Then he was eventually liberated in Czechoslovakia, um, and went to went to a DP camp in Bamberg, Germany. Entertained the prisoners there. He met his former drummer, who was also in Auschwitz, and they both entertained all these prisoners who were starved to hear music and whatever, and in the DP camps. And one of the things that happened to him was that he became noticed by the commander of the camp, who noticed that he spoke several languages, and he enlisted Louis in the CIC, which was an early precursor of the CIA, and Louis became a U.S. soldier, and was used to interrogate captured prisoners and so forth. And then after that, he went back to Holland. He met the love of his life at a party, this woman Flora, who became his wife, and they stayed in Holland for a while. But during I think the 1950s, when the Russians invaded Hungary, Louis took that as a sign that, I need to get out of here. I can't go through this again. And him and his young family, he had a son at that time. They moved to Canada. They went to Montreal, and Louis immediately started getting work as a musician. He played uh, these at the Queen Victoria Hotel, and he became fairly well known. And in around 1961, 62, he was noticed by somebody, by the Gillette Razor Company, whose wife was in one of the audiences and mentioned it to her husband. And he got a summer replacement TV show in Montreal called My Heart is a Violin, Mon cœur est un violin. And it became a kind of a big hit. Sadly, none of those shows are found. They were kind of destroyed. But anyway, but he became really popular, and tour and played all over Canada, Western Canada, and I think I had told you the story about how he was playing at the Hotel Frontenac in Quebec, and and Edith Piaf was playing down the road. And she had read his story in one of the papers there because they knew Louis' story about how he was a survivor. And she was so kind of blown away by his story that she came to see him and asked him to play with her. Um, and he made a special arrangement of La Vie en Rose, and which I think I played for you once. And that was one of the high points of his life as well. And
Mm.
then he settled in Toronto after that, and played and still played until he couldn't, and lived a fairly
Oh,
long life
mm,
until cancer
incredible.
until cancer did what the Nazis couldn't do.
Man. Well, how did you come to know Louis and
Well,
yeah.
it's I again in the late 90s I was working at an ad agency in New York, and we were given the assignment to work on pro bono assignment to work on the launch of the Museum of Jewish Heritage, which was still in construction phase. And so we were given the assignment to create like launch materials and TV commercials and so forth. Um, but before we did that, we went on a tour given by the museum director, and he was walking us through the site, as we were walking over wires and exposed wires and girders and steel girders and things. And he said, well, this, like will be this thing. Over here will be a tower from Czechoslovakia. Over here will be a wedding dress made from a parachute from a U.S. paratrooper. And over here in this glass case will be a trumpet that was played by a man who is known as the Dutch Louis Armstrong. And I said, what? And I kind of just filed the story away. Um, I mean, I wasn't at that time. I was and still am, a music lover, a jazz lover, and again, the thought of a trumpet in Auschwitz, and just the moniker of the Dutch Louis Armstrong was kind of intriguing to me. And so, flash forward to the time when we were creating some advertising. We said we're gonna create three stories, and we're gonna film. We're gonna get, because they were survivors. We were gonna bring them to New York and film them, and we did. And we were fortunate to have as our as our on-camera talent, Yitzhak Perlman and Meryl Streep. And so we brought Louis in from Toronto to film this commercial, and he was the consummate showman. And so we met, and we started talking. I started talking to him over lunch, and just he started the stories just started spilling out. And I just realized that this is way more than a 30-second commercial. And
Mm.
and so after all was said and done, I said, I'd like to write your story. I'd like to write a book about your life. And he said, sure. And so I basically took a leave of absence from my job, and I spent a whole bunch of time in Toronto, with my colleague at the time, who was also Dutch. His name is Jeroen, and him and I both went up to Toronto. Jeroen would sometimes work as a translator, and we both listened to these stories come out of Louis, and we just, you know knew there was something really, his story was just something we'd never heard before. And it's just so unusual that we had to, so what we decided to, so I decided to write a book.
What was it? Would you get together with him every day and talk, ask him
Yeah, well, I
questions or
would do
yeah.
come in spurts. We would,
Mhm.
we would go up there and, between, um, again, he was such a, again, he was such an amiable person. It was hard to believe that these stories were in his head, and yet he was so charming and funny and sweet. He, again, he had that band leader mentality. He had to sort of speak to the audience. He knew jokes. He knew how to
Mm.
keep an audience in stitches, and he did the same thing with us. Even with these stories. And so we went up there, and we would be eating our brown bread and butter and salmon, and his wife would give us a stroopwafel, the Dutch cookies with caramel, and
Oh
um,
yeah.
and he would just I hate to use the word regale us with these stories, but it would just come out of him. And so and then I got it all down, and wrote a proposal and sent it to a publisher, and the book came out. I mean, we knew that he had some health issues, and we knew that we wanted to sort of get this out there before before something happens. And so anyway, yeah, so the book came out, and
Mm.
and again, it really crystallized for him and for his family, again, because a lot of the stories that some of them didn't even know, that he never
Mm.
really talked about, which
Wow.
is really not unusual for survivors. They don't really sometimes talk about their story. Um,
Mm.
and so
What's interesting that for to me, I think it is that he didn't talk about it a lot around his family, but you'd get around you and just it would come
he just,
out.
I mean, he just really, I mean, again, he just opened up. It was
Mm.
really hard to stop him sometimes from talking about these stories. And his memory was incredible. And he again he had that I keep going back to that band leader mentality, and
Hmm.
he wanted us to know the story, and it was like he was setting up each story with a song. And so
Mm.
he again he was he always he used to say to us that I was famous before the war. When I was a boy, I was famous during the war. Again, he was a star in the orchestra and in
Mm.
Auschwitz, and I was famous after the war. And he said it very humbly, but it's kind of true, that when you think about it, as a young prodigy, he was famous as a violinist, and then he became a trumpet player, and then he became a
Mm.
star of the orchestra in the camps, and then he had his own TV show, and then he's playing around, Canada. So yes, he,
Mm.
he was right. He had his fame really was stretched between, his life, in all parts of
Mm.
his life, in good times and bad, you know.
Wow. Well, as you shared a couple videos with me that were really special, just watching him there was audio clips of him playing, but clips of him, video clips of him and his wife, and you could see how joyful he was. And as I was watching that, I kept thinking back to I was really lucky to be mentored by the great pianist Ahmad Jamal. And Ahmad, one of his big piece of advice to me was keep your enthusiasm. It's necessary. And, there's often times when I don't when he first told me that, I didn't really understand it. And then I started to understand it the more time went on. And to me, watching Louis and his joy, I'm like, this is why it's necessary. I mean,
Yeah.
what's the I don't know if takeaway, but what would I know there's the Viktor Frankl man, it's all in your attitude. Do you think what would Louis attribute his survival and his positivity towards? Is that just how he is, or do just thinking of lessons to kind of take into today?
Well, one thing he said jokingly was like, we asked him a similar question, and he said, practice. Because again, I mentioned that when he was like, 7 or 8, and his friends would be yelling out from the window, "Come on down and play," and he would say, "No, I'm practicing." And so, um, I mean, yes, it was that, but again, I think, the spirit. I mean, I really think he found that music was his key to survival.
mm,
And that worked, that was true for him when he was a poor young man in Rotterdam trying to feed his family, to when he was in the camps, and to when he left and and had to take care of his family in Canada.
mm,
He knew that music was his, that was, it wasn't just his instrument. It was what he needed to do to survive.
mm,
And the fact that it brought him so much joy was kind of the icing on the cake. And
mm.
he just, I mean, again, music was everything to him. It was everything.
Mm. Man, well, I know we're kind of wrapping it up. I could talk all day, but I guess just is there anything I've left out or anything you feel you'd like to share about any of this? I know it's such an
Um,
in-depth story.
well, I think one of the things that I used to take away after leaving Louis and Louis and his wife in Toronto was, this is such a love story. I know this
Mm,
sounds weird, but this was such a love story. The fact that he met his wife right after the camps, and and I remember he said, she was the healthiest woman I've ever seen. After seeing people in camps and emaciated or whatever, that I had to marry her. And so one of the things that was really amazing about making that documentary that you saw, that the TV station did in Canada, was while we were screening archival footage of some of the camps. Flora, his wife, noticed her husband in the footage, because she was married to a man who went for a walk one day and never came back, and he was arrested and sent to Buchenwald, and she never knew what
mm,
happened to him. She went into hiding, and we're looking at this footage, and she told us to stop the footage, and she knew that was her husband. His name was Barend, Brend, and
whoa.
and so and that was such an amazing
Mm,
experience. And and through again, this story is now like almost 25 years old, and the repercussions that's been happening, because people have heard about the story, have been really kind of like just mind-boggling. I think I told you about this friend of mine, John Snyder, who's a trumpet player, who um, who wrote this piece for a record that he did, the piece was called Louis Bannet, and it was based on Louis's tattooed numbers, which were 93626. He turned those numbers into a musical motif. And when he was asked why he did this, he said he was so inspired by Louis' story, but he wanted to make something beautiful out of something that was so ugly. And he created this beautiful piece that's on this record, called Snide Remarks. And um, I remember when he was playing it, um, in a club once, and again, it was, I would be getting chills, because the audience would go quiet, because he would always tell a little preamble about the story, and it was just so, when I heard when it, just to know that Louis' story was being carried forward, um,
mm,
and was so important to me, and I know would have been so important to Louis, because not only did John play this with himself, his son is on the record as well, who's also an amazing trumpet player. So again, the fact that this story is still going on, and still resonating, um, even when you contacted me, um,
mm,
after all these years, I'm kind of, it's just so touching, and
mm.
so touching.
Wow. Well, it's incredibly special. I'm so I mean, Louis is a hero just like Les McCann to me, really. I mean, and it's thanks to you that I've discovered the story, and I really hope people will pick up the book. It's Jazz Survivor, the story of Louis Bannet, horn player of Auschwitz. It's an incredible story. Thank you so much for this powerful, important conversation. It's really a treat.
My pleasure, Joe. It was so nice to meet you.